Welcome to the last lecture on this season's History on the Edge. Our speaker today is Ewa Kumelowski, who is currently a fellow at our institute and will present her current research on partisan care, everyday life of women in the Partisan Medical Corps. And she finished her PhD with the title Discourse Production in the Visual Art Scene During the Siege of Sarajevo in 2022 at Humboldt University in Berlin and at the Center for Turkish, Ottoman, Balkan and Central Asia Studies at the Cours des Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. Now, Eva, the floor is yours, and I'm looking forward to hearing about your work.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you as well for the invitation, for letting me present the beginnings of my postdoc project here, which is about the experiences in everyday life of women within the Partisan sanitary service, for which I center around the theoretical framework of care. So instead of focusing on professional divisions, I look beyond peacetime criteria for medical workers, to look at the experiences of both trained medical professionals and the auxiliary staff that supported them. Drawing inspiration from political theorists who discuss care as a restorative labor practice rather than an ethic, this theoretical framework enlarges the definition of medical work and includes the agency of historically overlooked populations and their wartime experiences. Integrating the various experiences of women medics into a single historical narrative, such an approach helps to understand who partisan sanitary staff actually were, how they exercised agency in a shifting social and political landscape, and to understand the lived experiences of women in the national liberation movement. Similarly, by taking an approach that looks at the Yugoslav region as a whole, and does not restrict itself to national borders, the full diversity of what it meant to be a woman in the partisans can be more easily explored. As the beginning of a new journey, this presentation will offer more questions than answers, but aims to underline a series of key aspects of women's wartime experiences that the study can offer particular insight into. In lieu of a structured thesis, I can instead offer a series of anecdotes and the questions that they bring forward. The sources I hope to base my research on broadly can be classified into three categories. So archival documentation stemming from military, state, and regional archives, memoirs and secondary literature published between 1950 and 1980-90 that tell the experiences of conflict participants, women partisans, Jewish and other minorities, and finally photographic sources located through the ex-Yugoslav republics. So, where to begin? The figure, for the initiated observer, the figure of the woman Partizanka, often associated with youth and bravery, is almost inseparable from the Yugoslav experience of the Second World War. Thanks in part to extensive presence of the partisan film genre in the region, references to women partisans were often embodied by the image of an armed girl who fights and tends to the wounded at the forefront of representations, typically framed within the context of major battles such as ones at Sutjeska or Neretva. The popularity of such archetypal roles of caring women is reflective of Yugoslav's centrality of women's participation in the partisan struggle against fascism, as emerging histories have come to underline the importance of gendered consideration within partisan strategies and nation-building practices. At the same time, the military medical sector played a central political role, both amongst the troops and within state-building processes. As repeatedly and publicly underlined by Josip Broz Tito, care for the wounded was determined to be a primary moral imperative of the fledgling army, setting it apart from numerous factions fighting for control of the region and laying the groundwork for their own political legitimacy. As Barton Kacker and Margaret Vining have remarked for other militaries, partisan women and girls formed a normal and essential, if not usually respected or even acknowledged, component of army infrastructure and integral elements in the organization of supply and maintenance. Made up of a combination of formally trained medical staff and inexperienced volunteers whose social backgrounds, education levels, and wartime trajectories varied greatly, the partisan medical service was heavily reliant on the labor of women. Who then were these women? What trajectories did they take to lead them to the medical corps? What were their relationships like to each other, to their families, to the army? Addressing these questions with an adapted microhistorical approach, I use Eduardo Grandi's concept of an exceptional normal as a way of speaking not only of the gendered questions, but also of their broad impact on the broader history of everyday life during the Second World War in Yugoslavia. So, what did women do in the medical corps? Women doctors represented a significant percentage of medical professionals who initially joined the conflict in 1941. So 11 out of 43 doctors in the beginning and 37 doctors by the end of the year. These numbers swelled to a total of 173 women doctors and some 100,000 formally trained nurses by the end of the war. According to Vera Gavrilovic, at least 5,000 women were working as nurses in operative formations by the end of the war. When counting those killed in combat, the number starts to go into the tens of thousands. However, most nurses were found in the main central hospitals, mobile surgeons units, and eventually in the mobile corps hospitals that were often staffed primarily by women. Available literature has largely homogenized an extremely diverse demographic. A partisan nurse could be either a city-dwelling nurse practitioner with years of experience, an illiterate peasant girl who attended a month-long course on basic physiology and first aid, or someone with no medical training at all. Medical students, although few in number, were regularly entrusted with responsibilities such as leading hospital teams or teaching nursing courses, while women pharmacists also made up part of the staff. Others worked as sanitary officers, a task assigned from units to hospital administrations to facilitate the political and strategic organization of the service. Unskilled auxiliary staff essentially managed these hospitals, providing cleaning services, food, and basic care. In some cases, they also took on nursing duties, for example, when soldiers were left to recover in friendly villages. Women affiliated with the anti-fascist women's organization AFG were often tasked with procuring food, household goods, and gifts for the hospitals. However, the way in which the labor of the AFG members practically supported the functioning of the sanitary service remains to be fully explored. All in all, and considering how Dr. Gojko Nikolic, the head of the Partisan Medical Corps, notes that the doctor and healthcare worker in the partisan war must be everything and everyone, the relative porosity between military and medical roles makes it difficult to speak of a single standard understanding of wartime experiences. Although scholars like Jelena Batinic assert that women in the medical service would find themselves in combat to the extent that a wounded soldier needed treatment on the spot or had to be removed from the battle zone, archival documents and secondary sources suggest that the overlap between combat and the rear meant that women themselves might not have agreed with the claim that their primary duty was considered off of the battlefield. In fact, many women who joined early on would often find themselves working both as a combatant and as a nurse for their unit. The radical social and cultural transformations that characterized the 20th century in this Balkan Third Front also led to the implementation of shifting strategies of collaboration and resistance, while social norms were put under constant stress, and calling for a flexible adaptation of actions, decisions, and choices. As a result, partisan strategies of mobilization and eventually rule over liberated territories relied on the appropriation of traditional culture as a means of building support through the relatively conservative areas, in particular in justifying women's active participation in the war. In this way, the reconfiguration of social norms and structures in some way reaffirmed gendered logics, while questioning the inherent nature of masculine and feminine roles, both in society and in the military. So, women in the partisan sanitet inhabited an unfavorable position within this military due to the dual discrimination familiar from other historical contexts, both on the basis of their gender and as a result of the systematic disregard for the medical corps as a military entity in and of itself. Partially the result of a self-fulfilling prophecy of feminization, the sanitet was often disregarded as young, female, and often inexperienced recruits that made up the majority of its body rarely elicited respect or authority. Women were often automatically assigned to the most tedious, physically strenuous, and least rewarding tasks, such as fetching water, doing the laundry, cooking, or cleaning. However, even when excluded from direct combat, the relegation of women to womanly tasks did not necessarily spare them from the danger of enemy attack, material insecurity, or disease experienced by their male counterparts. The disregard for female medical personnel, in particular those of nurses, appears to have been universal, regardless of timeline or geography. One report requesting additional material support for a hospital mentions women's nurses as being, in every regard, just as important as fighters, in an attempt at securing shoes for the nurses that had been working barefoot, as they had not been allocated the same resources as the men in their unit. Women would also often encounter mistreatment by those that they were caring for. The prevalence of this type of discrimination is remembered by Dr. Oskar Ginsberger to have been particularly salient for nursing personnel. Everyone used to lash out at the female nurses, the healthy, the sick, the wounded and the typhus-stricken, and the recovered, and often the doctors and the leaders themselves. The lack of military training for women, medical staff, attributed to gendered understandings of divisions of labor, meant that the medical personnel active in units was often unprepared for combat and seemed to have suffered above average casualties. So an incident in which a disproportional number of female unit nurses were killed in combat after blindly running after blindly running into battle, responding to taunts by male comrades, in this way resulted in a deadly show of bravery that is reflective of both a patriarchal disregard for women's valor and a total lack of military training of women nurses. This unpreparedness was in particular the result of the very nature of military medical sector, which almost in its entirety had no experience with actual military medicine or combat at the same time. Uneducated women were still charged with medical responsibilities and could use their positions as a means of gaining status in the wartime and post-war society. For example, Róża Oliacza, who had no formal medical training, was charged with running an improvised field hospital of the Romania Corps organized in a friendly village. In charge of a few nurses, only some of who had received basic first aid training in Sarajevo, she directed the functioning of a medical facility functional enough to have one nurse, Vuja, even perform amputations. She also had absolutely no medical training from what I've gathered. So although the poor treatment of female medical personnel was pervasive in virtually all echelons of the service, partisan relationships of care were primarily defined by the unusual intrusion of military logics into both traditional gender norms and traditional professional practices. The specificities of guerrilla warfare meant that the division between medic and combatant was often blurred, if not entirely non-existent. While the sanitet was often considered as the rightful place for women partisans, the instability of early combat situations meant that many of the early partizanskas participated in active combat as self-identified combatants. Although the actual scale of combat participation amongst female medical staff remains unknown, archival documentation such as that from the 4th hospital complex of the 5th Corpus, located near Kozarska, suggests that current scholarship vastly underestimates the combat experience of medical personnel. Such ambiguities are illustrated by the biography of national hero Rava Jankovic. Having joined the national liberation struggle early in the conflict, she was described posthumously as both a nurse and a combatant, and even performed both duties simultaneously. Categorically refusing to take on her duties unarmed, she was assigned to be a nurse purely due to her being the only woman in the company. One incident suggests that despite expectations, Jankovic regarded her duty as a soldier as primarily over her duty of care. Having been sent to a remote village to rebandage a comrade's stomach wound, she convinced her male partner to hold up a bus transporting some Ustasha soldiers on their way home to camp. While only her comrade was chastised for the late return that resulted from the successful mission, it is clear that the nurse identified more as a combatant than medical personnel, despite not being treated as such by her command. In addition to avoiding military discipline, as the only woman in her unit at the beginning of the war, she alone was charged with doing the laundry for the men, hand-washing it in a creek. Emerging histories support the idea that the complex strategies of the partisan military transformed both military and professional standards of care. In turn, the ways in which medical staff interacted with their patients and the way in which these interactions might have differed from previously accepted norms offer insights into the social, economic, and political changes taking place in the region. An incident recalled by Dr. Sasha Božović in her extensive memoirs refers to an order for a pregnancy termination for Gina Virbica, who herself did not agree to the procedure. Božović defied her superiors with the fabricated explanation that such an operation would be too dangerous for the patient. Basing her defiance primarily in the ethics of a peacetime care relationship, Božović's decision also exemplified an unusual closeness between doctors and their patients during this time. Once the child was born, an air raid forced the inhabitants and the staff of the hospital in question to flee to a secondary location in the forest, which ended up with mother and child being separated. In the meantime, Božović, who had actually had her own child during the conflict, at that time went on to personally breastfeed the infant of Virbica while she was awaiting her mother's return. So once the pair was reunited, she recalls an instance of unique solidarity. Both women ended up actually breastfeeding each other's children. Whereas such an intimate act would be inappropriate for a peacetime doctor-patient relationship, the combination of material insecurity, hunger, and the constant threat of danger eroded elements of formality inherent to traditional systems of care. Shared experiences of warfare also impacted patient care relationships in other ways. The rampant spread of infectious diseases in the region heavily defined the work of the sanitet. Regular outbreaks of epidemic typhus and typhoid fever meant that the care workers would often become the cared for and would sometimes have to perform both roles while they recovered. The exceptional case of Dr. Maria Schlesinger, who had fatally contracted typhus, but continued to care for her patients even in death, perhaps best illustrates such realities. Requesting to be buried at the entrance of the dugout in which a group of heavily wounded were hiding, her grave successfully deterred the scouting enemy from detecting those unable to evacuate from the first central hospital in Petrova Gora. Conversely, women doctors were also cared for by auxiliary staff while performing their duties treating infectious diseases. As such, local peasant women, we are not sure who these local peasant women were, faithfully removed and burned the lice found on the clothing of Dr. Zora Goldschmidt after doing her rounds treating typhus patients. Considering the doctor herself attributed her lack of illness to the vaccine she had received already in 1942, this incident suggests that the relationships of care were not only reserved for the patients, but also took on the form of a type of practice of community care within the context of the sanitary staff. So, talking about the private and the military. Romantic relationships by members of the partisan sanitet offer another entry point for discussing about what it meant to be a partisan woman. Demographically, much of the army was made up of young men from rural areas of Yugoslavia, often illiterate and raised in traditional gender relations. As such, the confrontation of young, impressionable men with professional women resulted in the reconfiguration of previously held beliefs. One instance discussed by Božović details a confusing encounter in which the doctor tended to a particularly unfriendly patient, whose sharp responses, red cheeks, and brusque manner she interpreted as signs of offense. However, multiple band changes later, over the course of a few weeks, revealed that her young patient had simply developed a crush on her. So, discussing this incident, Dr. Božović specifically considers her own position vis-a-vis the soldier, noting that his rural background would have most likely precluded him from interacting with any women in positions of authority, and much less ones that were close in age to them and attractive, making the experience somewhat of a shock for him. Generally speaking, the control exercised on romantic relationships between soldiers and medical staff seems to be rooted in military rather than civilian norms. While data regarding interpersonal relationships within the medical service remains to be explored, sexual abstinence and non-involvement in the units were expected. An example of rigid norms can be found in the denial of a marriage request issued by the Verkhovny Štab on behalf of a nurse assigned to the venereal disease wing of the 5th Corpus. Despite the residing physician's assurances that the patient who was going to be married, that his syphilis would no longer be infectious following the final course of treatment, the request was categorically refused from above, with a justification referencing broader policies on venereal disease. However, marriage amongst medical staff wasn't unheard of. Both nurses Ivan Kasker and Victoria Fuchs were married while in the forces, and the Archive of the Republic of Slovenia holds a few marriage licenses, interestingly documenting only marriages between hospital personnel, so marriages between members of the personnel, but not members and patients, for example. Evidence also suggests that the wives of partisan doctors would join the medical service alongside of their husband, as it was the case for Ružica and Martin Kolb, circumventing informal regulations that forbid couples from serving together. Therefore, it seems plausible that separate norms functioned for those within the sanitary service, although the reasons and modalities of such differences remain unknown. On the other hand, archival documentation suggests that the transfer of women in romantic relationships was a common practice also in hospital context. As such, Maramia Sinovic was transferred from her post for having sex with a comrade, with the argument that marriage at this point would be inconvenient. The transfer notice, which you can see here, is interesting also in and of itself, because it notes the transfer of 2 nurses for their problematic behavior in their previous postings, while the second person in this note, Zora Rastovic, is noted to steal food and belongings from her patients. So while it is clearly stated that Mara was not only good at her job, but actually also intended on marrying her partner, her relationship is presented in a similar problematic nature as that of somebody committing an entirely different sort of infraction. Furthermore, the transfer is done because it will affect the others, and they will have better control in one company. So what forms could community care take in this kind of a context? So community care practices appear to have made partisan medical infrastructure a space of safety for many of those hoping to escape the conflict, in particular for children. Although the assumption of incompatibility between warfare and motherhood has been largely repeated in available literature, a variety of sources illustrate how older female children would often join the medical corps alongside their mothers. Gojko Nikolić's sister, together with her 2 children aged 11 and 6, was charged with bandages and caring for the wounded, while Dr. Sidonia Lipman and Dr. Frida Gutman both had their daughters assist in the sanitet. Dr. Sasha Božović, whose other writings also detail the bravery of a handful of teenage nurses, even took in an accidentally encountered a girl to assist her, hoping to protect the vulnerable refugee traveling alone. However, Božović was unable to protect her ward. An Axis bombardment hit the hospital column in which they were traveling, causing the girl to be crushed to death by a horse. Nevertheless, it appears that sheltering children by engaging them with the medical sector was at least sporadically practiced. So you can see in some photographs from Petrova Gora specifically that you have what seems like quite a lot of very young women, if not girls, that were in some way engaged in different aspects of sanitary work. So here, the legend of the image, it shows a handful of, what seems to me more girls than women, at least some of them, bringing food to the wounded. Whereas you can also see very young women taking care of the soldiers that were stationed in the hospital. Beyond functioning as a purely military or medical institution, the static elements of the partisan sanitet were also spaces of cultural and educational socialization, from personnel as much as they were for the patients. The medical service functioned as a tool of upward social mobility for young women, both educated and not. Medical courses, primarily targeted at young girls and women from the countryside, offered practical training in subjects such as basic first aid, concepts of hygiene and epidemiology, sterilization, and patient care. Such courses encouraged the professionalization of large numbers of women otherwise excluded from positions of power. The partisan medical service can be considered as the first major higher education facility accessible to young peasant women across Yugoslavia, and therefore also an institution of upward social mobility. The introduction of medical courses by the sanitet took place early on in the conflict, and while not exclusively so, was specifically targeted at women and girls. The Communist Youth League introduced medical courses for girls already in the summer of 1941, with the explicit intention of dispatching the young nurses to ambulances and units at this time. As the war progressed, training for nurses further improved as sanitet developed a network of courses at lower and intermediate levels, usually taught by actual doctors or otherwise trained medics. Such courses took place under the banner envisaged by Nikolic, so each hospital a medical school. The introduction of month-long lower nursing course, in which literacy seemed to be optional, teaching basic first aid, concepts of hygiene and epidemiology, and other aspects of patient care, to largely younger demographics, would potentially also offer new opportunities for many that would otherwise not have had access to this type of education. So, one report from a seaside nursing school found in the documentation of Pavla Jerinalach paints a rather idyllic picture of singing women focused on their studies and accompanied by an older maternal figure who cries as they sing. Although the author of this text is unknown, the text clearly demonstrates how expected experiences of the partisan nurses might have differed from lived reality. None of us thought that we were actually in a war, in a fight. So, one of the most interesting and elusive aspects of partisan care comes in the form of medical work performed by auxiliary staff whose very duties often came close to, if not overlapped, with traditional medical work. Often associated with the AFG and rarely classified as hospital personnel beyond as cooks, the labor provided by these rural women upheld key elements of infrastructure capable of sustaining a more or less functioning medical system. However, little is actually known about the women who performed this aspect of care work, despite evidence suggesting that their presence in hospitals provided key pillars of their functioning. Literature suggests that in areas with weak infrastructure, the brunt of everyday medical work fell on rural women who cooked meals and washed the linen, while the girls and the younger women cared for the sick and the wounded, attending to their needs day and night, reading to them, etc. While usually reserved for early stages of the war or contexts of troop movements, in which the heavily wounded soldiers were temporarily stashed in private homes, it was not uncommon for hospital wings to be organized in villages and simply left in the care of local women. In turn, the gender-driven expectation of care placed on women meant that a traditional relationship between the carer and the cared for would primarily be ruled by personal and not professional considerations. The role of older women in hospital structures has been largely absent from documentation, making it difficult to place this demographic in any sort of analytical continuum. However, broadly defined so-called older peasant women regularly appear in archival or photographic material, often as a footnote. So who were these local peasant women that made sure that Zora Goldschmidt's clothing was free of lice? Who were the two women in Petrova Gora in the photograph at the beginning of this presentation, whose traditional clothing and age stands out from the rest of the hospital staff in the picture? Who was the woman crying while the nursing course participants sang? As previously announced, I don't have the answers to these questions yet, but I can offer some insight into this generally unknown demographic. An unpublished article written by Paula Jelina-Lach on the topic of mamice w partizanskich bolnicach offers unique insights into the place of such people in hospital structures. Apparently part of a larger work on women in the medical sector, the article details the biographies of a handful of older women in hospital structures. It is interesting to note that one of the biographies, that of Maria Pirc, knows that her fame extended to the recognition by not only functionaries of the Glavni Štab and the entire valley, but also that of the AFG. Whereas it is often assumed that women of similar age and performing similar functions went through the AFG, the fact that they didn't creates a different understanding for who these people were and their relationship to the partisan cause. So, according to the articles written by Paula Jelina-Lach, a number of older women would join the partisan forces with their husbands or sons. It is possible that they were most commonly documented as cooks, as is the case for Maria Pirc, mother of Stanko Pirc-Lojzek, who was a referent saniteta for the 1st Slovenian Udarna Brigada, Tonet Tomšič. And another protagonist of this article is Maria Mramor, who offered her house to the partisans when needed and eventually ended up following them. So she and her husband are described by this text in the following way. They became real elders and masters in the hospital. The mother cooked, kept the house, managed the whole economy. The husband did the same. Beyond the reappearance of questions of personal and family relationships in the dynamics of everyday partisan life, the role of older rural women played in hospital structures appear to be simultaneously have been regarded as central to the medical structure, but has functionally been undervalued in available historiography. So, in view of a conclusion, I would like to briefly return to the picture that featured on the poster for this presentation, which comes from the archives of the Imperial War Museum. So, the original caption of the image reads, "A group of partisan and civilian women stand with other members of the Yugoslav Liberation Army after arriving at the air evacuation center at Bari, Italy." So, what can I tell you about the people in this picture? At the moment, that is very little. I don't know who the women in the foreground were, but the context of the image gives some clues and some questions that, for me, make it quite interesting. So statistically, it is likely that the majority of women in this picture were at some point considered in some way as medical staff, if only on the basis of their gender, or they could also have actually been an integral part of it. So photographed next to soldiers who are clearly undergoing medical treatment and therefore most likely evacuated to Bari, was it possible that at least some of these uniformed women were in charge of caring for them? How did civilian women end up being evacuated? Or were they not civilian women at all, but actually part of the hospital staff? While containing a multitude of unanswered questions, this photograph, I think, exemplifies and underlines some of the key aspects I would like to explore in this project. The gender nature of the structures that made the partisan medical corps functional, the diversity of experiences of women integrated into these structures, and the need for revisiting their histories to fully understand the social context in which they existed. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to hearing your comments and questions and suggestions on what you think of this subject.
Thank you very much. now it's time for questions. We accept them, of course, both on Zoom and in person. If on Zoom, just type them into the chat and they will get sent to me. But yeah, first, to open the floor, does anyone have any ideas, comments, questions?
Silence, my favorite.
Well, if not, I'm curious, because you have started to look at sources now, and you kind of got a feel a bit of what you can expect, I guess. But I'm curious that, do you anticipate you will find some personal sources as well of the women who are working in the sanitary groups?
So yes, I actually already found some of them. So this I haven't integrated into the presentation, but for example, in the in a series of documents from Pavla Irinalach for the articles that she wrote, she actually apparently seemed to have made some public call over radio and through publications for women from the Sanitet to send in their biographies, and they actually did. So there is, for example, a whole stack of biographies written by women or by their superiors from the hospitals that really detail their own, their whole, let's say, experiences and their stories from this period. Another thing that I think you can also find in archival sources that I've also found here and there is also the documentation written by women who were in positions of authority within the Sanitet structures. So there is a host of letters detailing personal issues or things like that. So there is, I've only kind of started looking at the tip of the iceberg, but seeing as it's just the beginning, I think that really there is a potential for finding quite a lot.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions, dilemmas, suggestions? Maya?
Thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting. I think it's a very promising subject. I'm not sure, like, how much of the sources do you have, like those individual ego documents and so on. So I was just wondering, how are you planning to generalize or not to generalize? This relationship between individual and general experience, especially in an area of Yugoslavia which is so diverse, like from Slovenia to Macedonia. So how are you planning, like, just to confront this problem? Because I always have this problem when I'm looking at my sources, how many statements and how many sources do I need to have to get some a bit more general statement out of something, and not just to have some anthropological individual experience approach.
So thank you for the question. I think that what is interesting for me is that I don't think I intend on making generalizations about this is what women experience in the Sanitet. However, what does interest me more is the fact that these generalizations already exist and what kind of other experiences might counteract these existing narratives. So there is really a lot of material. I think that's also why my work at the moment is so fragmented, because there is a lot between the memoirs, between archival documents. You find a lot of voices and different experiences throughout the sources. And talking about this demographic not as it's being representative or these experiences as being representative of all military experiences of women during this period, but opening more of a broader window of possibilities. So to say that a partisan nurse was not only a partisan nurse, but it could also be she could also be something else, rather, she was a partisan nurse, but that there is a diversity of these experiences that haven't been studied. So that's more what I intend on focusing on.
And how are you planning to confront this geographical, cultural, historical diversity of the space?
So I have, actually those are one of the two questions that are, let's say, most difficult to deal with. So it's the question of geographic and space, and the question of time as well, because the material conditions were very, very different at the beginning of the conflict and at the end of the conflict, and the people involved were also demographically quite different. So this kind of maybe goes back to my focus on the individual experiences. So by following the actors themselves, you find certain overlap. I don't think it's definitely not possible to do this for every single partisan nurse or every single partisan doctor, but you can trace also the trajectories of people, and within these trajectories, I think this is maybe, from what I know, maybe the specificity of the sanitary service was that many women, and maybe also generally people involved in it, were not limited to one geographical area. They moved around a lot. So, for example, Sasha Božović, she's originally from Belgrade. She ended up incarcerated in Montenegro, and then she crossed through most of Bosnia, and I think possibly also into Croatia. So there is, through these actors themselves, you can also trace the different places where they went to. But I don't know if it's possible to have like a comparative analysis as well on a geographical scale, but to see the diversity between these kinds of experiences.
Thank you. Any more? Just a second. Okay, it took a while to get the text. Okay, so we have a question from Lea Kniz. Thank you for the lecture, very informative and interesting. I would like to ask if you have any information on how the women who received medical education during the war used their qualifications after the war. So what percentage of them stayed in the medical profession, or were their roles reverted back to traditional roles, which actually is a thing that I was thinking in between as well a bit, yeah.
Yeah, so this is something that I also don't know yet. I can offer some anecdotes once again. So from doctors specifically, I think that there was a significant amount of women doctors who ended up either continuing their medical careers or also staying in the military medical sector. So, for example, Dr. Rosa Papo, she was actually promoted to a general. She was the first female general of the Yugoslav army, and she stayed within these military structures, I think, until the end of her life. Whereas, yeah, I think that many of the women doctors or medical students that were active during this time, they ended up either finishing their studies or continuing with their specializations, and they continued to work. Sasha Božović, she also wrote quite a lot, so she's also remembered as quite a novelist. And for the nurses, that's also a little bit more of a complicated question, because there is more of them and they're not as, let's say, well-known or easily findable. From what I have seen, for example, the two women, Victoria and Ivana, I believe, they, for example, after the end of the war, they ended up marrying also partisans, and they complained about living in a bad socioeconomic situation. And I don't think that they continued working as nurses. So this is actually a very relevant and important question that I don't really have an answer to, but it's interesting to see also what women would do with their education, for example, after becoming a partisan nurse, and what their trajectories were post-war.
Thank you. Any more questions from the public? Tiasha?
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. So I wanted to ask you if you maybe came across any special, like a description of how this, how women, once they were in the partisans, if they were there was any special like argumentation why women should join. So did they need to defend themselves, or was it just like a natural process once they joined? So I remember that I read some sources about how, you know, women eat less, so it makes sense to include them into partisan units and so on. So maybe if you have some examples of that.
Yeah, so I haven't actually come across that so much in the sources. There's quite a lot of, let's say, like propagandistic literature. There was a lot of like military bulletins and medical newspapers that were published, and they did kind of emphasize the importance of women as a working power, and also from a moral, like morale boosting side. So one of the things I do find once in a while, for example, in these medical journals, the celebration of the 8th of May, and the women from the AFG came to the hospital, and the patients now feel supported. But I haven't specifically come across that yet. However, I think it's quite possibly also very similar argumentations to what is generally also appearing in literature, that, well, women, their traditional role is to take care of the household also during the war. So, well, the household is now moving, but they can move with us and to do this work so that men can actually go off and fight. But I don't have a concrete example of this.
Thank you. Any more? If not, Ewa, I would like to ask you for an excellent lecture to finish off our spring season and leave you alone during the summer, but you will be welcome to rejoin us for quite an interesting session, I think, back in September. So thank you to Ewa, thank you to the public, both live and on Zoom. And now everyone who's here in person is kindly invited to join us for coffee and some cookies in the back. Thank you and goodbye.